I helped Queen Elizabeth's bodyguard, and he revealed the darkest UFO case. There are moments in life when everything you thought you knew about reality shatters in a single breath, and for me, that moment came on a rain-soaked night in a London hospital corridor when a dying man gripped my wrist and whispered words that would unravel the fabric of my faith and rebuild it into something infinitely more vast. I'm a trauma surgeon, and I've seen death approach 1,000 times, watched souls slip between worlds with that final exhalation, but nothing prepared me for the weight in his eyes, a mixture of terror and sacred duty as he begged me not to let him die. His chest was open before me, blood pooling faster than we could suction, his heart struggling against injuries that should have killed him instantly, and yet he remained conscious, lucid, staring into my soul as if searching for something he desperately needed to find. "I carry a secret," he gasped between compressions, his voice barely audible over the chaos of monitors and shouted commands. "Something that changes everything. You have to save me, doctor. Please, the world needs to know." I remember how my hands moved with practiced precision, muscle memory taking over while my mind reeled at the impossible intensity radiating from this stranger, this man who wore the unmistakable bearing of military discipline even as his body failed. His injuries were catastrophic, the kind you see in targeted attacks, deliberate and brutal, yet there was no identification on him, no wallet, nothing except a small silver pin. On his torn jacket, a crest I recognized but couldn't immediately place. As I worked to repair his torn vessels and stabilize his failing organs, I felt something I'd never experienced in all my years of surgery, a presence in that operating room that made the air feel thick with purpose, as if invisible hands were guiding mine, as if this man's survival was written into the fabric of destiny itself. Hours later, when he finally stabilized and the monitors settled into steady rhythms, I stood alone in the scrub room, my hands still trembling from adrenaline and something else. Something that felt like the brush of eternity against mortal skin. The senior nurse approached me with confusion in her eyes, telling me that his file had been immediately classified, that men in dark suits had already arrived asking questions, and that I was to speak to no one about his case. But it was the way she looked at me that unnerved me most, as if she could sense that I'd been marked by this encounter, chosen in some inexplicable way to be part of whatever mystery surrounded this man. I went home as dawn broke over the Thames, the city awakening to ordinary concerns while I carried the weight of those desperate words, a secret that changes everything, repeating in my mind like a sacred mantra. Sleep wouldn't come, and when I closed my eyes, I saw not the surgical field but his face, aged with the burden of knowledge, weathered by years of watching and waiting, and I knew with absolute certainty that my life had just pivoted on an invisible axis. 3 days passed in a strange fog of routine surgeries and mundane consultations. But my thoughts never left that operating room, never stopped wondering who he was and what secret could possibly warrant such desperation. Then, on the 4th morning, a handwritten note appeared in my locker. No postmark, no return address, just elegant script on cream paper that read, "You saved my life, and now I must trust you with something far more precious. Meet me where the river bends toward the old chapel tonight, and I will show you what lies beneath the crown." I stood there in the hospital's fluorescent glare, the note trembling in my fingers, and felt the world tilt toward the impossible, toward a revelation that would bridge heaven and earth in ways I couldn't yet comprehend. Every rational part of my medical training screamed caution, warned of danger and illusion. Yet something deeper, that same presence I'd felt in the operating room, whispered with crystalline clarity that this was the moment my entire life had been preparing me for. I thought of my faith, of the God I'd worshipped since childhood in quiet Anglican churches, of Jesus whose love I'd felt like warm light on winter mornings, and wondered how those sacred truths could possibly intersect with classified files and desperate secrets. But as I slipped the note into my pocket and felt its weight against my heart, I remembered the words from Ephesians that my grandmother had taught me, "For we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness in high places." Perhaps, I thought, perhaps the darkness wasn't what we'd been taught to fear, and perhaps the light of divine truth was about to shine from the most unexpected of sources. The chapel bells rang across London as evening fell, their ancient bronze voices calling me toward a threshold I couldn't see, but could feel with every fiber of my being, a doorway between worlds that had opened the moment that man's blood touched my hands. That night, as I walked along the Thames toward the meeting place, the city lights reflecting on dark water like scattered stars. I prayed not for protection but for understanding, for the courage to hear whatever truth awaited me and the wisdom to know how to carry it forward into a world that had forgotten how to look up at the heavens. With wonder, the old chapel emerged from the mist, its stone walls holding centuries of whispered prayers and sacred mysteries. And there, standing in its shadow, was the man I'd saved up right now, healed impossibly fast, his eyes burning with the same intensity I'd seen on that operating table. He extended his hand, and when I took it, I felt a current pass between us, not electrical but spiritual, a recognition that we were both servants of something far greater than ourselves, instruments being tuned for a symphony that had been composed before the foundation of the world. "Thank you for coming," he said, his voice steady now, commanding yet gentle. "I'm going to tell you something that will sound impossible, but I need you to listen with both your mind and your soul, because what I witnessed, what she witnessed, proves that God's creation is more magnificent and terrifying than any scripture dared to fully reveal." He gestured toward the chapel's ancient door, and as it opened, I stepped forward into the darkness, into the beginning of a testimony that would forever change how I understood faith, power, and the thin veil between the earthly and the eternal. The chapel's interior was colder than the night outside, but it wasn't the chill of stone and age that made me shiver. It was the weight of anticipation, the sense that I was standing at the edge of a precipice from which there would be no return. He closed the door behind us, and in the dim light of votive candles flickering before a wooden crucifix, I could see his face properly for the first time since the surgery. And what struck me wasn't just how remarkably healed he appeared, but the depth of sorrow etched into every line, as if he'd been carrying an impossible burden for so long that it had become part of his very structure. "My name is Richard," he began, his voice echoing softly against the vaulted ceiling, "and for 23 years, I served as personal protection for Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II, a position that placed me in proximity to power, history, and secrets that most people couldn't imagine." He moved toward the altar, his hand trailing along the worn pews where generations had knelt in prayer, and I found myself following, drawn by the gravity of his presence and the trembling certainty that what he was about to reveal would redefine everything I thought I knew about sovereignty, divinity, and the hidden architecture of our world. I was there on the night shifts when prime ministers called with crises, present during private moments when the crown weighed heaviest on her shoulders, and I watched her navigate the impossible balance between duty and humanity with grace that seemed almost supernatural. He continued, turning to face me with eyes that reflected the candlelight like dark mirrors. "But there was one night, Doctor, one night that separated everything into before and after, a night when I understood that the royal bloodlines, the ancient traditions, the very concept of divine right, all of it was connected to something so much larger than political theater or historical accident." I felt my breath catch as he reached into his coat and withdrew a leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed with time and handling, the cover embossed with a seal I didn't recognize, symbols that seemed to blend Christian iconography with geometric patterns that looked almost celestial, as if someone had tried to map heaven using mathematics and sacred geometry. "After you saved my life, I spent 3 days in prayer," Richard said, his fingers trembling slightly as he held the journal, asking God if the time had finally come, if the oath of silence I took could be broken without betraying her memory. And I received an answer in a way I cannot explain except to say that I felt her presence, the Queen's, as clearly as I feel yours now, and she gave me permission. No, she gave me a commission to find someone who could receive this truth with both scientific rigor and spiritual openness. He placed the journal in my hands, and the leather was warm, impossibly warm, as if it had been held close to someone's heart for years, and when I opened it, I saw handwriting that was precise, elegant, unmistakably royal. Entries dated across decades that spoke of encounters, visitations, and a covenant that stretched back through centuries of British monarchy to something even more ancient. "She kept records," he whispered, and I heard awe in his voice, the same awe I'd heard from parishioners describing moments of divine encounter. Records of communications that happened periodically throughout her reign, moments when she was contacted by what the official files called unidentified phenomena, but what she privately understood to be messengers, celestial guardians who had been watching over humanity's spiritual evolution since the time of Christ himself. I looked up from the pages, my medical mind struggling to categorize what I was reading, while my soul recognized truth in a language beyond words. and I saw tears streaming down Richard's weathered face. Decades of enforced silence finally breaking like a dam that could no longer hold back the flood. "I need you to understand something before I continue," he said, his voice raw with emotion. "I am a man of faith, baptized in the Church of England, confirmed before the Archbishop of Canterbury, and I have never wavered in my belief that Jesus Christ is the Son of God and the Savior of mankind. What I'm about to tell you does not contradict that truth. It illuminates it, expands it, shows how the Incarnation was part of a cosmic plan that involved not just our small planet, but the entire tapestry of creation that God wove across the stars." He moved closer, and I could smell the faint scent of incense on his clothes, as if he'd spent hours in deep prayer before this meeting, preparing himself for the sacred act of testimony. The beings she encountered, the ones I witnessed with my own eyes on a night that still makes my hands shake to remember. They spoke of Jesus with reverence that would make the most devout monk weep with recognition. Richard continued, his words coming faster now, urgency building like a storm gathering. Strength. They showed her visions of the crucifixion from perspectives that no human could have witnessed, angles that revealed how that singular act of divine love rippled outward, through dimensions we don't have names for, affecting not just humanity, but countless other expressions of God's creative power across the cosmos. I felt the chapel spinning around me, or perhaps it was my understanding of reality itself that was spinning, recalibrating, expanding to accommodate the impossible possibility that divine truth could be so much vaster than our little theological boxes had contained. "She asked them directly," he said, and now his voice dropped to barely above a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might shatter the sacred space we'd created. "She asked if they were angels, and they responded in a way that transcended language. They showed her that the distinction between angelic beings and what we call extraterrestrial is a limitation of human vocabulary, that God's messengers take many forms across many worlds, and that our ancestors who wrote scripture did their best to describe encounters with the divine, using the only frameworks they possessed." The candles flickered as if responding to his words, casting dancing shadows across the crucifix above us, and I found myself thinking of Jacob's ladder, of Ezekiel's wheels within wheels, of all the strange and wondrous encounters that filled the biblical text with mystery and power. And suddenly they didn't seem like primitive misunderstandings, but like glimpses through a veil that was never meant to fully hide the magnificent complexity of God's creation. She was shown that the royal bloodlines were established not through mere political conquest, but through ancient agreements between these celestial guardians and certain human families, who were tasked with protecting knowledge, preserving wisdom, and preparing humanity for an eventual awakening, when we would be ready to understand our place in the divine order. Richard explained, his hand gripping the back of a pew as if he needed physical support to continue. The Queen understood that her crown wasn't just a symbol of earthly authority, but a responsibility that transcended national borders, a sacred duty to hold space for truths that couldn't yet be spoken openly, but that hummed beneath the surface of every state ceremony, every royal protocol, every ancient ritual that outsiders dismissed as mere pageantry. I thought of how she'd reigned for 7 decades with such unshakable composure, such profound dignity, and wondered how heavy that secret knowledge must have weighed, how isolating it must have been to smile through endless public appearances while carrying an understanding of reality that she couldn't share. On that night in 1997, everything I thought I knew about my role, about protection and service, was transformed, Richard said, and he looked at me with such intensity that I felt he was trying to transfer not just information but experience itself, because I realized I wasn't just protecting a monarch, I was witnessing a continuation of the same divine conversation that began when angels announced Christ's birth to shepherds, when the star guided the wise men, when heaven and earth intersected in ways that forever changed the trajectory of human consciousness. And I knew then that I would carry this burden until the moment came when it could be transformed into revelation. Richard paused, his breathing heavy as if the memory itself required physical exertion to retrieve from the locked chambers of his mind. And then he began to describe that night in 1997 with such vivid detail that I could almost see it unfolding before me in the candlelit chapel. It was late September, a Thursday evening when the autumn mist was rolling in across the grounds of Windsor Castle, and I was on duty in the private apartments corridor when the alert came through. Not the standard security protocol we'd rehearsed countless times, but something different, something that made the senior officers' voices tight with controlled panic over the radio. He said, his eyes distant as he relived those moments. Within minutes, we were executing an evacuation procedure I'd never seen before, moving the royal family to a secure location beneath the castle, a series of rooms that dated back centuries and were reinforced during the Cold War for scenarios we all hoped would never materialize. He described how the Queen had remained perfectly calm, even as military vehicles arrived with unusual speed, how she'd placed her hand on his arm and told him that whatever happened next, he must remember that fear and faith cannot occupy the same space in the human heart. I didn't understand what she meant until we were all secured in those underground chambers, monitoring equipment set up by personnel I didn't recognize, their uniforms bearing insignias I'd never seen in 20 years of service. And then someone said the words that made my blood run cold. It's directly above us now, Your Majesty, hovering at approximately 300 feet, completely stationary, and it's not responding to any attempts at communication. The stone walls around us seemed to press closer as Richard spoke, as if the chapel itself was leaning in to hear this impossible testimony. I saw it on the monitors first, a craft that defied every principle of aerodynamics I understood. No visible means of propulsion, no sound signature despite its massive size. Just this geometric structure that seemed to shimmer between solid metal and pure light, as if it existed in multiple states simultaneously. He continued, his voice dropping to that whispered reverence again. But what terrified me more than the object itself was watching the Queen's face as she studied those screens. She wasn't surprised, Doctor. She was expectant, like someone who'd been waiting for an important guest to arrive, and had finally heard the doorbell ring. He told me how the military commanders had urged her to remain underground, how they'd discussed response options with the kind of clinical detachment that barely masked their own terror. But the Queen had simply stood, smoothed her dress, and declared with absolute authority that she would go to them because they had clearly come to her. I've never felt so torn between duty and disbelief, between my training to protect her from all threats and the growing understanding that this wasn't a threat at all, that somehow she knew exactly what was happening while the rest of us were flailing in ignorance. Richard said, his hands clenching and unclenching as if he could still feel the weight of the weapon he'd been carrying that night. We emerged from the underground passage into the private garden, and that's when I saw it with my own eyes, not through a screen or a second-hand report, but directly. This luminous presence suspended above the ancient stone of Windsor Castle like a star that had descended to converse with the earth. He described how the craft seemed to pulse with rhythms that reminded him of breathing, of heartbeats, of something fundamentally alive rather than merely mechanical, and how the air itself felt charged with an energy that made the hair on his arm stand up, and his mind suddenly clear of all the tactical protocols that had been drilled into him. Then they came, he whispered, and I saw his whole body shudder with the memory. Beings of light that emerged from the craft, not by descending on beams or using any visible technology, but simply by appearing, as if they'd stepped through a doorway between dimensions. And I understood in that instant why Scripture describes angels as beginning their messages with fear not, because the human nervous system isn't equipped to process such direct encounters with the divine. Without overwhelming awe, the Queen had walked forward alone, ignoring the protests of her security detail, and Richard had watched helplessly as she approached these luminous figures, with the same graceful composure she'd shown meeting presidents and popes. I couldn't hear what was being communicated. It wasn't happening through sound but through something deeper, a transmission of meaning directly into consciousness. But I could see her face in the glow they emanated, and what I witnessed there was recognition, wonder, and a profound peace that seemed to radiate outward from her like ripples on still water. He said, his voice breaking with emotion, the beings appeared almost human in form but simultaneously beyond form, as if Richard's eyes were trying to interpret something that existed partially outside normal space-time, and he described how their presence felt simultaneously ancient and eternal, carrying a weight of wisdom that made him think of prophets and mystics throughout history who'd tried to describe the indescribable. They communicated with her for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, and during that time, I saw images not with my physical eyes, but somehow projected into my awareness, visions of Earth, from perspectives impossible for human technology, scenes from history that I recognized from Scripture, but seen from angles that revealed new dimensions of meaning. Richard explained, his words tumbling out now as if a dam had finally broken after decades. I saw the nativity and understood that the Star of Bethlehem was guidance from these very beings, coordinating the cosmic significance of the incarnation, ensuring that witnesses would be drawn to that moment when divinity clothed itself in human flesh. He told me he saw the crucifixion and resurrection from a perspective that showed how that event rippled through dimensions, beyond our three-dimensional understanding, how Christ's sacrifice wasn't just a historical moment, but an eternal fixture in the architecture of reality itself, a hinge point around which all of creation pivoted. The beings showed the Queen, and somehow I was permitted to glimpse it too, how Jesus was fully human and fully divine in ways that transcended our theological debates, how his ministry was supported by celestial guardians who understood they were witnessing God's direct intervention in the evolution of consciousness across the cosmos. Richard said, tears now flowing freely down his face. They revealed that the ancient bloodlines, including the royal houses of Europe, had been established through contact with these guardians, who were tasked with preserving certain knowledge until humanity reached sufficient spiritual maturity to integrate it without descending into either religious fundamentalism or materialistic reductionism. The Queen had been shown specific locations, specific artifacts, and given understanding about the true history of Christianity as a cosmic religion, not limited to one planet or one people, but expressing a universal truth about divine love that echoed across all of God's vast creation. When the encounter ended, Richard described how the beings simply faded from perception rather than departing in any conventional sense, how the craft above them dissolved like morning mist, and how the Queen had turned to her stunned security detail and military observers with complete composure and said that what they had witnessed must be protected until the proper time for revelation arrived. We were all debriefed, sworn to secrecy under protocols that went beyond official secrets acts into something almost like sacred vows, and I understood that I had been entrusted not just with state secrets, but with spiritual responsibility, he said, looking at me with such intensity that I felt the full weight of what he was offering by bringing me into this circle of knowing. The Queen told me privately, days later, that she had been prepared for that encounter through dreams and intuitions throughout her reign, that the guardians had been subtly communicating with the royal line for generations, and that her role was to serve as a bridge between ancient wisdom and the coming age when humanity would need to understand that God's creation is infinitely more magnificent than our limited theologies had imagined. He explained how she'd lived the rest of her life carrying this knowledge, how it had informed her quiet dignity and her remarkable ability to provide stability during times of chaos, how she'd understood herself as a steward of mysteries that couldn't yet be spoken, but that would eventually need to be shared for humanity to take its next evolutionary step. When she died, I felt released from my oath of silence, or rather, I felt the oath transform from silence into sacred obligation to speak, to find someone who could receive this testimony with both the skepticism of science and the openness of faith. Richard concluded, his hand now resting on my shoulder with gentle weight. That's why I whispered to you in that emergency room, Doctor, because in my delirium between life and death, I saw that you were meant to hear this, that your particular combination of medical precision and spiritual hunger made you the perfect vessel to carry this revelation forward into a world that desperately needs to understand that we are not alone, that we have never been alone, and that the universe is ablaze with divine intelligence guiding us toward our highest destiny in Christ. Richard leaned forward, his weathered hands trembling slightly as he continued, and I found myself holding my breath as he described the moment when the military personnel arrived at Windsor Castle with a precision that spoke of rehearsed protocols for scenarios the public never imagined existed. They came in unmarked vehicles, Doctor, moving with the kind of coordinated efficiency that told me this wasn't their first encounter with something beyond conventional threat assessment, and I watched as they unloaded equipment I'd never seen in 2 decades of security briefings, devices that hummed with low frequencies I could feel in my chest, instruments with displays showing readings that meant nothing to my trained eye but everything to the specialists operating them, he said, his voice carrying the weight of a man who'd spent years reconciling what he witnessed with everything he thought he knew about reality. The senior military officer, a woman whose insignia Richard didn't recognize, but whose authority was unquestionable, had approached the Queen with a deference that somehow acknowledged both her earthly sovereignty and the cosmic significance of what was unfolding above them, explaining in calm tones that the craft had made no hostile movements, but was emitting energy signatures that suggested awareness, intention, and something the officer described as communication. Attempts and formats were only beginning to understand. Richard told me how he'd stood there in the private garden, his weapon feeling absurdly primitive in his hands, watching the luminous craft pulse with rhythms that reminded him simultaneously of the Northern Lights he'd seen as a boy in Scotland and the sacred music he'd heard in cathedrals, a visual symphony that seemed to be singing in frequencies that bypassed his ears and resonated directly in his soul. The moment the beings emerged from the craft was seared into Richard's memory with such intensity that, as he described it to me, I could see his pupils dilate as if he were witnessing it again in real time, reliving the impossible beauty and terror of entities that appeared to be constructed from living light itself, their forms shifting between distinctly humanoid shapes and something more fluid, more essential, as if what he was perceiving was merely the three-dimensional shadow of beings who existed in dimensions his mind struggled to conceptualize. They were approximately 7 feet tall, Doctor, but height seems inadequate to describe their presence. They occupied space differently than we do, as if they were simultaneously here and elsewhere, and the light that composed them wasn't harsh or blinding, but somehow gentle, inviting, like the quality of illumination you see in sacred art when painters tried to capture divine radiance. He explained, his medical training evident in his attempt to catalog the uncatalogable, to find objective language for a subjective experience that shattered all frameworks. He described how the military personnel had immediately raised their weapons, not in aggression but in the instinctive human response to the unknown. Yet the beings showed no reaction to this display of primitive force, instead simply standing there in a posture that Richard could only describe as patient welcome, like parents waiting for frightened children to realize there was nothing to fear. The Queen had raised her hand, a gesture that carried such authority that every weapon lowered simultaneously, and Richard watched as she stepped forward with the same composure she'd shown at thousands of state functions. Except now there was something else in her bearing recognition, as if she'd been preparing for this encounter her entire life, and the moment had finally arrived. What happened next defied Richard's ability to articulate clearly even decades later, but he tried, his words coming slowly as he searched for language adequate to the experience of watching the Queen engage in communication that transcended spoken language, her face illuminated by the being's gentle radiance as information seemed to flow directly between consciousness and consciousness without the clumsy mediation of words. I couldn't hear dialogue, but I could sense meaning, Doctor. Impressions that flooded my awareness even though I was standing 20 feet away, images of Earth spinning through space, not as a random rock in an indifferent cosmos, but as a carefully tended garden in a universe ablaze with intentionality and love, a planet chosen for a specific divine purpose in the great unfolding story of creation. Richard whispered, his eyes glistening with tears that caught the chapel's candlelight. He told me he suddenly understood that these beings were not aliens, in the sense of foreigners to God's plan, but rather servants of that plan, celestial guardians who had been watching over humanity's spiritual evolution since before recorded history, ensuring that key moments of divine revelation were protected and preserved. The military specialists were frantically taking readings on their equipment, but Richard noticed that several of them had stopped recording and were simply watching with expressions of wonder that transcended their professional protocols, as if the beings' presence was dismantling years of materialist conditioning and awakening something dormant in their souls. He saw one hardened colonel weeping silently. Another officer had fallen to her knees in what looked like spontaneous prayer, and Richard himself felt his own certainties dissolving, his carefully constructed worldview expanding to accommodate the staggering possibility that the universe was far more sacred, far more purposeful, and far more directly guided by divine intelligence than his Anglican upbringing had prepared him to imagine. The Queen stood in conversation with these luminous beings for what Richard estimated was nearly 20 minutes of Earth time, though he admitted that temporal perception seemed distorted during the encounter, moments stretching into eternities while simultaneously passing in heartbeats. And when she finally turned back toward her security detail and the assembled military personnel, her face carried an expression Richard had never seen before and would never see again, an integration of profound joy and equally profound responsibility, as if she'd been shown both the magnificent destiny awaiting humanity and the difficult choices required to reach it. She walked back to us with tears streaming down her face, but she was smiling, Doctor. really smiling in a way that made her look simultaneously ancient and youthful, as if the encounter had connected her to something eternal that existed before her birth and would continue after her death, Richard said, his own voice breaking with the emotion of the memory. The beings had remained visible for a few moments longer, and Richard described how one of them had turned specifically toward him, though it had no eyes in the conventional sense, and he'd felt the communication directed personally to him, a message that told him he would carry this knowledge as a sacred trust and that when the time came, he would know who needed to hear it. Then the beings simply faded from perception, not departing dissolving like morning mist touched by sunlight, and the craft above them executed a movement so swift and silent that Richard's trained eye could barely track it before it vanished into the night sky, leaving only stars and the ancient stones of Windsor Castle and a group of witnesses who would spend the rest of their lives trying to integrate what they'd experienced into their understanding of reality, faith, and humanity's place in God's vast and mysterious creation. Richard's voice dropped to a whisper as he described what the Queen had shared with him in the secure briefing room 3 days after the encounter, her words carefully chosen yet unable to fully contain the magnitude of what she'd experienced during those 20 minutes of communion with beings who existed at the intersection of matter and spirit, servants of a divine plan so vast and intricate that human language could only gesture toward its meaning. She told me they communicated through visions, Doctor, not mere pictures, but fully immersive experiences where she simultaneously witnessed events and understood their spiritual significance, where past and future collapsed into an eternal present that revealed the hidden architecture of God's relationship with humanity across millennia. Richard explained, his hands clasped together as if in prayer. The Queen had seen ancient bloodlines stretching back beyond recorded history, not as mere genealogical curiosity but as sacred trust, lineages chosen and protected by these celestial guardians to preserve knowledge that humanity would need when consciousness evolved enough to receive it. Without destroying itself in fear or pride, she witnessed moments when these beings had intervened throughout history, not to override human free will but to ensure that certain teachings, certain revelations, certain individuals carrying crucial spiritual DNA would survive humanity's darkest impulses toward violence and ignorance. Richard's eyes held mine with burning intensity as he recounted how the Queen described seeing Christ's ministry through this cosmic lens, understanding that his message of divine love wasn't confined to one planet or one species, but represented a universal truth. These beings had been teaching across galaxies for eternities beyond human comprehension. The visions had shown her a covenant made in ages so ancient that human civilization was merely a distant possibility, an agreement between what religious tradition called angels and what modern minds might call extraterrestrial intelligence, though both terms failed to capture beings who existed as instruments of God's creative will across dimensions. Our physics barely theorized. She saw gatherings in places that no longer exist, Doctor, temples beneath oceans that have shifted, mountains that have eroded to dust, meetings between these luminous guardians and human leaders who understood that earthly power carried cosmic responsibility, that kingdoms and bloodlines were not accidents of conquest, but careful cultivation of consciousness capable of holding sacred knowledge without corruption. Richard said, his voice trembling with the weight of revelation. The Queen had witnessed herself in this lineage, not from vanity, but from humility, understanding that her role as monarch was shadow and symbol of a deeper truth, that certain families had been entrusted across generations with the responsibility of protecting humanity's connection to the divine even when that connection was forgotten or denied by the very people they served. She'd seen documents hidden in royal archives across Europe, texts and artifacts that told a story dramatically different from official histories, evidence that the church fathers and ancient kings had known about these celestial visitors and had built their theology and governance to accommodate truths too dangerous to speak openly. Richard described how the Queen had wept as she told him this, not from grief but from the overwhelming burden of understanding that everything she'd dedicated her life to, every ceremony and tradition she'd upheld, carried layers of meaning she'd sensed but never fully comprehended until beings of light opened her awareness to perceive the sacred patterns woven through human history. The beings had shown her humanity's future as well, branching possibilities that depended on choices not yet made. And Richard's voice grew urgent as he recounted this part of her testimony, the warning and promise intertwined in visions of what we might become if we chose wisdom over fear, unity over division, Faith over cynicism that masqueraded as sophistication. She saw a threshold approaching, Doctor. A moment in human development when our technology would grow powerful enough to either liberate us or destroy us. When our consciousness would either expand to embrace our true nature as spiritual beings in a divinely guided cosmos or contract into materialist despair that recognized no meaning beyond the physical, Richard said, leaning forward as if the urgency of the message demanded physical proximity. The Queen had witnessed timelines where humanity made contact with other civilizations among the stars, not as conquerors or victims but as younger siblings welcomed into a galactic community of beings who all served the same divine source, who all recognized Christ's teaching of love as the fundamental law of consciousness itself, regardless of the different names and forms through which various species had received this eternal truth. She'd also seen darker possibilities, futures where fear of the unknown drove humanity into isolation and violence, where the revelation of celestial guardians was twisted into xenophobia, or exploited by those seeking power rather than enlightenment. Timelines where we destroyed ourselves not through lack of knowledge, but through refusal to integrate what we learned with the wisdom of the heart. Richard told me the beings had emphasized that this threshold was approaching within decades, not centuries, and that certain individuals would be called to prepare humanity by sharing truths. That how Richard paused, his breathing shallow, and reached into his jacket pocket with trembling fingers, withdrawing a folded photograph that had been handled so many times the edges were soft as fabric, the image itself carrying the weight of secrets that had aged him far beyond his years. The beings didn't just show her visions of the past and future, Doctor, they gave her specific instructions, coordinates embedded directly into her consciousness like a memory she'd always possessed, but only now could access, he said, unfolding the photograph to reveal an infrared image of Westminster Abbey's foundation. Strange geometric patterns glowing beneath layers of stone and earth that had witnessed coronations stretching back through centuries of English history. The Queen had described waking the morning after the encounter with absolute certainty about what lay hidden there, knowledge that came not from research or documentation, but from direct transmission, the beings having unlocked something within her awareness that connected her bloodline's deepest purpose with an artifact placed there long before the Abbey itself was consecrated. Richard explained that she'd waited 3 months before acting, wrestling with whether this revelation was divine calling or psychological aftermath of trauma, consulting with only her most trusted advisors, who themselves struggled to reconcile faith, duty, and the impossible reality of what their sovereign claimed to know with such unwavering conviction that doubt seemed almost offensive. The excavation happened under absolute secrecy during renovation work already scheduled, a convenience that Richard insisted was itself evidence of providential timing, rather than mere coincidence, as if forces beyond human planning had been orchestrating events toward this moment of discovery. They found it exactly where she said it would be, Doctor, 17 feet below the chapel of St. Edward the Confessor, encased in a chamber that predated Norman construction by at least 500 years, sealed with symbols that appeared in no historical record yet somehow felt familiar, as if human consciousness retained ancestral memory of their meaning, Richard said, his voice dropping to barely audible reverence, as he described the artifact itself, an object roughly the size of a human heart, metallic yet not any metal known to modern science, its surface covered in markings that seemed to shift between ancient Hebrew, early Christian iconography, and geometric patterns that matched nothing terrestrial yet everything sacred. The Queen had held it in her hands during a private viewing, with only Richard present as witness to her tears, and she'd whispered that she could feel it resonating with something deep within her chest, a frequency that made her aware of every person who'd ever touched it across millennia, kings and prophets and beings of light who'd entrusted humanity with physical proof that heaven's interest in earth was neither recent nor abstract, but intimate, continuous, and purposeful beyond our comprehension. Richard then reached into his other pocket and produced something wrapped in black silk, his hands shaking so violently I thought he might drop it. And when he carefully unfolded the cloth, I saw a fragment no larger than my thumbnail, its surface catching the dim light of my office and reflecting it back in colors that shouldn't exist together, iridescent yet somehow also emanating illumination from within rather than merely reflecting what surrounded it. This piece separated from the main artifact during examination, Doctor, and the Queen insisted I keep it, told me it would serve as proof when the time came to share what we'd witnessed when humanity was ready to understand that the God we worship through Scripture and tradition is the same divine intelligence that guides countless worlds through servants we've called angels and others might call extraterrestrials. Though both words fail to capture beings who exist as pure extensions of creative love, Richard said, placing the fragment in my palm where it immediately generated sensation unlike anything I'd experienced, not heat exactly, but presence, as if holding concentrated attention, benevolent awareness compressed into matter that responded to consciousness itself. My medical training insisted this was impossible, yet my fingers registered the gentle vibration, my heart rate increased without distress, and my mind suddenly filled with images I couldn't have invented, vast cathedrals floating in space, human figures kneeling before luminous forms, and above it all a sense of Christ's teaching as cosmic principle rather than merely historical event, love as the fundamental architecture of reality itself designed by a creator whose imagination exceeded every limit we'd placed upon divinity through our need to make the infinite manageable. The fragment seemed to pulse in rhythm with my own heartbeat, and I understood in that moment why the Queen had carried this secret with such solemnity, why Richard's face bore the marks of years spent holding truth too magnificent to speak, yet too vital to keep silent forever. The beings told her this artifact was placed there as seed and symbol, Dr. Physical reminder that when Westminster Abbey was built as Christianity's stronghold in England, it was constructed over much older foundations where these celestial guardians had met with human leaders who understood their mission was protecting not political power, but spiritual knowledge, the teaching that God's love extends throughout creation and forms and manifestations our limited theology had tried to contain within single planet, single species, single understanding, Richard explained, his eyes searching mine for signs of belief or rejection, finding instead something I felt emerging within myself, not certainty exactly, but willingness to entertain that faith and cosmos might be speaking the same language in different vocabularies, that the divine mystery we'd worshipped through ritual and doctrine was inviting us toward expansion, rather than reduction of wonder. I held that fragment in my palm, feeling its impossible presence, and knew that whether I fully believed Richard's account or not, something profound had shifted in my understanding of what was possible, what was real, and what God's infinite creativity might have accomplished across galaxies and ages, while we assumed heaven's attention was limited to our small corner of an unimaginably vast sacred creation. Richard's hand steadied as he laid 3 manila folders on my desk, each stamped with classifications I'd only seen in films, their edges worn from handling, yet their contents pristine as if preserved through obsessive care that transcended mere documentation and became active devotion. These photographs were taken by military intelligence within minutes of the being's arrival, Doctor. And what you're about to see contradicts every official record of that night, every public statement, every carefully constructed narrative designed to maintain the illusion that our leaders govern a world where heaven remains comfortably distant and theoretical, he said, opening the first folder to reveal images that made my breath catch despite years of medical training that had taught me to maintain composure before the impossible. The photographs showed Windsor Castle bathed in light that seemed to originate from everywhere and nowhere simultaneously, illumination that didn't cast shadows but rather revealed everything with equal clarity. And suspended above the ancient stones was a craft whose geometry hurt to observe directly, its form suggesting dimensions my eyes couldn't quite process yet my mind insisted were somehow more real than the 3 I'd always known. Richard pointed to figures emerging from radiance at the craft's base, humanoid in suggestion but composed of light that moved with intention and grace, beings whose very presence in these grainy military photographs carried authority that made me understand why the Queen had walked toward them without hesitation, recognizing perhaps what prophets and mystics had always known, that divine messengers appear in forms we're ready to perceive. The second folder contained documents I couldn't fully comprehend, technical analyses attempting to explain energy signatures that defied known physics, witness statements from military personnel who described feeling overwhelming peace despite professional training that should have triggered defensive protocols, and most striking of all, a handwritten note on Buckingham Palace stationery in what Richard swore was the Queen's own script. She wrote this the morning after the encounter, Doctor, when the visions were still fresh enough to burn behind her eyes, yet already receding into that space where revelation must be translated into words that inevitably diminish what was directly known. Richard explained, his finger tracing lines written in elegant cursive that spoke of beings who communicated not through language but through transmission of understanding itself, showing her that the royal bloodlines of Earth had been entrusted with stewardship of knowledge, connecting human spirituality with cosmic reality. The Queen's words described how these celestial guardians had appeared throughout history under different names and interpretations, sometimes called angels by those who encountered them through Christian framework, sometimes understood as ancestors by indigenous peoples whose traditions maintain the truth that heaven's interest in humanity was neither recent nor remote but intimate and ongoing as a parent's love for children learning to walk. She wrote that they'd shown her Jesus not as figure confined to first-century Palestine, but as manifestation of divine principle that resonates throughout creation, the Word made flesh representing God's desire to experience and redeem material existence through love that transcends every boundary we'd constructed between sacred and secular, spiritual and physical, earthly and cosmic. Richard then unwrapped the metallic fragment again, but this time he asked me to hold it longer, to move past initial shock and let myself truly feel what it was trying to communicate, beyond the impossible fact of its existence. In my rational medical office where I'd spent years treating bodies as mechanical systems rather than vessels for consciousness-seeking connection with its divine source, the Queen told me this fragment carries memory, Doctor, that the artifact itself was designed not just as proof, but as teaching tool. Technology so advanced it appears miraculous, yet serves the same purpose as scripture or sacrament, helping finite human awareness glimpse the infinite creative love that sustains every atom, every galaxy, every precious soul struggling to understand why we're here and whether we matter to the vast intelligence we call God, Richard said, his voice thick with emotion that came from years of carrying this burden alone. As I held the fragment, allowing its strange vibration to resonate through my palm and up my arm, I felt my skepticism softening not into blind belief but into humble recognition that my materialist certainty about reality's limits was itself a kind of faith, one perhaps less justified than the possibility that divine mystery might be larger, stranger, and more wonderful than theological categories or scientific models had allowed me to imagine. The fragment grew warm in my hand, and suddenly I experienced not quite vision but impression, fleeting awareness of vast networks of consciousness extending throughout space and time, civilizations rising and falling under the watchful care of beings who served a source that humans had encountered through burning bushes, angelic visitations, and now crafts that defied gravity because they operated on principles where matter and spirit hadn't yet been falsely separated. They showed the Queen that Westminster Abbey was built over ancient meeting ground, Doctor, where these guardians had communed with human leaders who understood their purpose wasn't accumulating power but protecting wisdom, maintaining connection between Earth and heaven until humanity matured enough to consciously participate in cosmic community, rather than remain isolated children convinced we were either alone or the center of everything, Richard explained, gathering the documents with care that suggested handling holy relics rather than classified files. I returned the fragment to him with reluctance, my palm still tingling with residual energy, my heart somehow both racing and perfectly calm, and I recognized that whether these beings were angels in traditional sense or extraterrestrial servants of the same God made no difference. What mattered was the message that we were loved, watched over, and being guided toward awakening that would reveal Christ's teaching as universal truth rather than tribal claim, divine love as cosmic force rather than denominational possession. Richard leaned forward, his weathered face illuminated by the soft glow of my desk lamp, and in his eyes I saw not the paranoia of conspiracy theorist, but the burden of prophet who knows his message will be dismissed by those too comfortable in their small understanding of reality's dimensions. The beings didn't just show her the past, Doctor. They revealed what's coming, what must come if we're to survive the threshold we're rapidly approaching, and their warning wasn't given with detachment of observers cataloging primitive species, but with urgency of parents watching beloved children walk toward cliff edge, while arguing about whether gravity is real, he said, his voice dropping to whisper that somehow carried more weight than any shout could have managed. He explained that the Queen had been shown visions of humanity's near future, timelines branching based on choices we were making in these very years, and what struck her most profoundly wasn't the technology or the cosmic scope, but the simplicity of the message at the heart of everything these advanced beings had traveled light years to deliver. They showed her cities burning and cities thriving, Ecosystems collapsing and ecosystems restored, communities fractured by fear and communities united by recognition that every human soul carried the same divine spark, regardless of nation, religion, or any other category we'd invented to justify treating some of God's children as less worthy than others. The threshold they spoke of wasn't technological or political, but spiritual, a moment fast approaching when humanity would collectively choose either to continue path of division, exploitation, and materialist emptiness that was killing both planet and spirit, or to embrace the truth that Christ taught. And these beings confirmed that we are one family under one God whose love extends through dimensions we're only beginning to perceive. They told her, the covenant made with royal bloodlines millennia ago wasn't about preserving privilege, Doctor. It was about maintaining connection to this larger reality until the time came when all people could access the wisdom directly, when the intermediaries and institutions wouldn't be necessary because every human being would recognize themselves as temple where divine and material meet. Richard continued, pulling from his jacket a small leather journal whose pages were filled with his own handwriting, notes taken over years of processing what he'd witnessed that impossible night. He read passages describing how the beings had communicated that Jesus represented an evolutionary leap for human consciousness, incarnation of divine love in material form that demonstrated what we're all meant to become, bridges between heaven and earth, not because we're separate from either, but because we're designed to consciously integrate both into lived experience of sacred creation. The Guardians explained they'd been present throughout human history under countless names, appearing as angels to Abraham, as pillars of cloud and fire to Moses, as the star that guided wise men to Bethlehem, always working to nurture humanity's spiritual development while respecting the free will that was God's greatest gift and most dangerous blessing. They showed the Queen that her role, like all true leaders, wasn't to control or dominate, but to serve as anchor point for this higher awareness. And they warned that the structures of power, religion, and economics built on separation rather than unity were approaching collapse, not through divine punishment but through natural consequence of systems designed against love's fundamental nature. Richard's hands trembled slightly as he closed the journal, and I realized this man who'd stood guard over monarchs and witnessed wonders that defied explanation was terrified not of the beings themselves but of humanity's capacity to reject the very salvation being offered because it came packaged differently than our traditions expected, because it asked us to expand rather than defend our understanding of how God works in creation. They said the time of secrets is ending, Doctor, that the old agreements about hidden knowledge must give way to direct revelation because we're either ready to mature into cosmic community or we'll destroy ourselves through willful ignorance. That mistakes scientific materialism and religious fundamentalism for wisdom when both are forms of fear, dressed as certainty, he told me, his voice breaking with emotion that came from years of knowing humanity's fate hung on choices we were making in ignorance of what was truly at stake. The beings had shown the Queen that faith and science weren't enemies, but complementary ways of exploring the single reality that flows from God's creative intention, that the physics allowing their craft to cross interstellar distances, and the love that drove Christ to the cross emerged from the same source, and that our insistence on keeping them separate was like trying to understand human being by studying only skeleton or only soul while denying the other's existence. They'd emphasized that their appearance wasn't to replace Earth's religions but to fulfill them, to reveal that every authentic spiritual tradition had touched aspects of cosmic truth that needed integration rather than competition, that Allah and Yahweh and the God of Christians named the same infinite creative consciousness these beings served with technology we called miraculous, and devotion we called angelic. I sat in silence after Richard finished, feeling the weight of his testimony settling into my chest like stone that was simultaneously burden and foundation, something heavy yet essential for building structure capable of bearing truth's full magnitude without collapsing into either rigid certainty or hopeless relativism. What do they want from us, Richard? What's the choice we're meant to make? I asked, my voice barely audible even in the quiet of my office where I'd spent years focused on saving individual bodies while remaining oblivious to the larger body of humanity whose health depended on recognizing our fundamental interconnection. Richard looked at me with expression combining profound sadness and unshakable hope, the face of someone who'd seen both humanity's potential for transcendence and our talent for self-destruction. And his answer came with simplicity that made it no less challenging to actually embody in a world structured around competition rather than cooperation. They want us to choose love over fear, Doctor. To recognize that every scientific discovery revealing the universe's vastness and every spiritual teaching about compassion and unity are describing the same reality. That we're not accidents in meaningless void but cherished participants in cosmic story of consciousness learning to know itself through infinite expressions of divine creativity, he said, standing slowly as if the conversation had physically exhausted him. They want us to understand that the second coming we've been waiting for isn't one man descending from clouds, but humanity, collectively, awakening to Christ consciousness that was always our destiny, becoming the beings of love and light we were created to be, finally ready to take our place among the stars not as conquerors, but as contributing members of universal family that's been waiting patiently for us to grow up and come home. That night I lay in bed unable to sleep, Richard's words circling through my mind like prayers I'd forgotten how to say properly. And somewhere in the gray space between waking consciousness and dreams, I felt a presence in my room that should have terrified me, but instead filled me with peace so profound it brought tears streaming down my face before I'd even opened my eyes to see them. Standing there, three beings of luminous geometry, forms that seemed simultaneously solid and translucent, humanoid yet beyond any human proportion, and their presence radiated love with such intensity that every wound I'd ever carried, every patient I'd lost, every moment of doubt about whether my work mattered in universe so vast and indifferent to all of it dissolved in recognition that indifference was the one thing this cosmos had never felt toward any of its children. They didn't speak with voices, but communicated directly into my consciousness with clarity that surpassed language. And their first message wasn't complex theology or advanced physics, but simple statement that shattered and rebuilt my entire understanding. You have always been known. You have always been loved. And you were called into Richard's story because your heart is ready to hold truth that will seem impossible to minds still trapped in either or thinking that cannot comprehend how God works through dimensions beyond your current perception. The tallest being moved closer, and suddenly I wasn't in my bedroom but standing in space itself, earth turning below me in blues and greens and whites so beautiful I understood immediately why these beings had traveled unfathomable distances to ensure we didn't destroy this jewel that God had planted with such care in the cosmic garden they tended across galaxies. Your species stands at threshold between childhood and maturity, between seeing yourselves as separate fragments competing for scraps, and recognizing yourselves as singular organism whose health depends on every cell understanding its connection to the whole, the being, communicated, and I watched as timelines branched before me like living trees. One withering into darkness where cities crumbled and oceans rose and humans turned weapons on each other in final desperate scramble for resources we'd squandered. Another flowering into light where the same cities transformed into gardens and the same humans who might have fought instead collaborated to heal what had been broken and create what had never existed, beauty born from conscious choice to serve love rather than fear. This is the revelation that Christ embodied and that we have guarded through your history. That divinity doesn't exist separate from creation, but flows through every atom, every heartbeat, every act of compassion that recognizes the sacred and seemingly mundane. And your religions weren't wrong but incomplete, describing aspects of infinite reality that must now be integrated into comprehensive understanding of how consciousness creates and experiences itself through forms as diverse as stars and souls. The being gestured, and suddenly I saw Jesus not as figure from ancient texts but as living presence, whose message rippled forward through time with power that increased rather than diminished. And I understood with shocking clarity that the second coming wasn't about one person returning, but about humanity collectively awakening to Christ consciousness that lived in every human being as potential waiting for activation through choice to love as he loved, unconditionally and without limit. The bloodlines weren't about genetic superiority, but about maintaining connection to this awareness through families who agreed before birth to serve as anchors. And now that time of intermediaries ends, because the knowledge can no longer be contained by institutions that have too often used it for control rather than liberation, the being showed me, and I saw Westminster Abbey from above, its stones glowing with sacred geometry that connected to similar patterns beneath mosques and temples and holy sites across the planet, networks of divine energy that humanity had always sensed but couldn't fully perceive until we developed both spiritual maturity and scientific instruments capable of measuring what mystics had experienced directly for millennia. The artifact beneath the abbey isn't object to be possessed, but key to be understood. Physical pro. Of that what you call supernatural and what you call natural emerge from single source. And when humanity accepts this integration, your species will join community of conscious beings who serve God's creative intention throughout cosmos by nurturing life wherever it emerges and protecting free will that allows genuine love to exist rather than programmed obedience. When I returned to my body, the beings remained for a moment longer, and their final message carried weight of both blessing and commission. Recognition that I'd been changed by what I'd witnessed and therefore bore responsibility to share what couldn't be unlearned or forgotten. Tell them that faith wasn't meant to separate people but to unite them in recognition of shared divine origin, that science wasn't meant to eliminate mystery but to reveal deeper mysteries worthy of worship, and that the choice before humanity isn't between God and cosmos, but recognition that God's greatness exceeds every boundary. Your theologies have tried to construct around infinite creative consciousness that births galaxies and treasures sparrows with equal attention. They communicated, and then they were gone but not absent. Woven into my awareness now is permanent expansion of what I understood reality to contain. I rose from bed as dawn light filled my window, fell to my knees not from religious habit, but from overwhelming gratitude that existence itself was prayer, that my work as surgeon healing bodies participated in cosmic work of consciousness caring for itself through temporary forms, and that Richard's courage in sharing forbidden truth had activated something in me that could never return to comfortable smallness of life lived as if Earth were all that mattered, and humans were all that God loved in creation vast beyond our comprehension, yet intimate enough to know every soul by name. The morning after the beings departed, I sat at my kitchen table, with Richard's photograph spread before me like sacred texts, and I knew with certainty that transcended doubt that my life had been irrevocably divided into before and after, that I could no more return to comfortable ignorance than a butterfly could fold itself back into its chrysalis and pretend it had never learned to fly. Richard arrived at noon as we'd arranged, his face searching mine for signs of how I'd received what he'd shared, and when he saw tears streaming down my cheeks, he understood immediately that these weren't tears of skepticism but of recognition that something had confirmed his story in ways that required no physical evidence, because truth had inscribed itself directly onto my soul. "They came to you," he said quietly, and it wasn't a question, but acknowledgement between two people who'd been entrusted with knowledge that would seem like madness to those still sleeping but felt like sanity itself to those awakening. We prayed together then, not from ritual but from necessity, thanking God for love vast enough to span galaxies yet intimate enough to visit London bedrooms, for patience with species still learning to see beyond surfaces, and for grace that used broken people like us as messengers because our very brokenness made us humble enough to serve truth rather than our own importance. "What will you do with it?" Richard asked, and I told him what the beings had shown me, that this wasn't about convincing skeptics or fighting institutions, but about planting seeds in hearts ready to receive them, trusting that truth grows according to its own divine timing in soil, prepared by longing for something greater than narratives of isolation and cosmic accident. I began writing that very afternoon, capturing every detail while it burned fresh in my memory, and as words flowed onto pages I felt accompanied by presence that guided my hands toward clarity, helping me find language for experiences that existed beyond ordinary vocabulary. The story wasn't mine alone but belonged to Richard's courage, to the Queen's secret wisdom, to the beings who'd traveled unfathomable distances to remind us we'd never been abandoned, and ultimately to God, whose creativity expressed itself through methods so diverse and magnificent that our theologies had captured only fragments of infinite whole. I wrote about the surgery that had seemed like random emergency, but was divine appointment, about classified documents that proved conspiracy of love rather than control, about artifacts beneath ancient stones waiting for humanity mature enough to understand that sacredness wasn't contained by buildings but flowed through creation itself. I wrote about Jesus not as exclusive gateway that shut billions out, but as perfect demonstration of what every human carried as potential, Christ consciousness that recognized divine nature in all beings and invited us to love without conditions or boundaries or fear that God's grace might run out if extended too generously. I wrote about the being's warning that threshold approached, that we could choose transcendence or destruction, unity or fragmentation, and that choice wouldn't be made through single dramatic moment, but through million daily decisions to act from love rather than fear, to see connection rather than separation, to trust that universe fundamentally supported life because life was how God experienced and expressed infinite creative joy. When I shared the manuscript with close friends, their reactions divided exactly as I'd expected. Some dismissing it immediately as delusion or fantasy, others reading with tears streaming down their faces as something deep within them recognized truth their minds hadn't known how to articulate, but their souls had always sensed. This will destroy your reputation, one colleague warned with genuine concern, and I understood his fear, because I'd felt it myself. Terror that speaking truth would cost me everything I'd built through decades of careful professional development. But the beings had shown me that reputation built on pretending universe was smaller than it actually was, constituted prison rather than achievement, and that freedom came through alignment with reality, regardless of who believed or mocked or turned away, uncomfortable with implications too vast for their current frameworks. I published the account online without fanfare or attempt at viral marketing, simply offering it to whoever might need confirmation that their mystical experiences weren't madness, and their sense of divine presence beyond traditional categories wasn't heresy, but expanding revelation. Within hours, comments arrived from people across continents describing their own encounters with luminous beings, their own sense that Christianity and cosmos weren't competitors, but complementary expressions of God's infinite nature, their own relief at finally finding language for spirituality that honored both Jesus and the stars, both scripture and science, both ancient wisdom and emerging understanding that consciousness itself was fundamental fabric of reality, woven with intention and saturated with love. The story spread not through algorithms, but through hearts recognizing themselves in experiences they'd thought isolated them, but actually connected them to community of seekers hungry for integration rather than division. And I realized this was how transformation happened, not through institutions mandating change from above, but through individuals awakening to truth and sharing it with courage that gave others permission to acknowledge what they'd always known but feared to speak. Richard and I met monthly after that, sometimes joined by others who'd witnessed similar events or felt called to bridge the perceived gap between faith and cosmos. And our gatherings felt like early church meetings must have felt, when revolutionary truth was still fresh and dangerous and absolutely necessary. We never tried to build organization or establish doctrine because the whole point was liberation from structures that claimed to contain infinity, inviting people instead into direct relationship with divine presence that spoke through scripture and stars, through prayer and quantum physics, through ancient rituals and unprecedented revelations. The being's promise had proven true, that speaking this truth wouldn't bring disaster but alignment, wouldn't isolate me but connect me to spiritual family, scattered across planet waiting for permission to embrace comprehensive vision of God's creativity that excluded nothing and invited everyone into participation, with cosmic work of consciousness caring for itself through love that never ended and never failed, and never stopped seeking new ways to remind every created being that they were cherished beyond measure in universe that existed as expression of divine joy too vast for any single tradition to capture, but beautiful enough that every tradition reflected some authentic facet of infinite whole. What if everything you believed about heaven was smaller than what God actually created? Subscribe to hear more stories that expand faith beyond limits.